Over the past several years, Anton He has made waves as an award-winning translator from Korean into English, perhaps most notably as the translator of the works of Bora Chung, as well as the non-fiction books of Baek Se-hee, I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki. And now, after years of demonstrating his impeccable literary knowledge and skill as a Korean to English translator, we have his own debut novel, Toward Eternity. Full disclosure, Anton is a very dear friend of mine, and when we review the works of our friends, certain questions start popping up with regards to bias and favoritism. But I'll say this now, if I didn't like this book, I would just not review it. However, friend or not, I mean it when I say that Toward Eternity is now one of my favorite science fiction novels ever. And it is so cool that I get to say that about a book that my friend wrote, because he's an extraordinary talent. And before I go any further, I also want to mention that Anton is going to be touring the UK very, very soon, visiting bookshops around the country and doing talks in front of audiences, and you can get tickets if you happen to be nearby. And if you're in Scotland, I will be interviewing Anton at the Argyle Street Waterstones here in Glasgow. That interview will be on the 12th of August, and tickets are available right now on the Waterstones website. I'll put a link in the description. So if you're in Scotland, come see me interview Anton on the 12th of August. It's going to be a really fun evening. Now let's talk about Toward Eternity and what makes it so special. The first curious thing I want to say about this book is about the blurb, and I find myself increasingly talking about blurbs more and more as time goes on, because blurbs are such curious and strange things. The blurb for this book is pretty long, and yet it spoils nothing. When I first read it, I was like, wow, I feel like I know the whole book. You don't. The blurb gives away so little of the grand scope of this novel. It's amazing how much happens. And to add on to that, it's short. This book is like 250 pages. It has an enormous amount of scope, all contained within a very small amount of space. And if this story had been handled by any other science fiction author, the book would have ended up being 600 pages long. Anton has written something short and concise and yet enormously grand in scope. And what I mean by that is the places we go to and the time that transpires, but also the amount of philosophical depth that exists within this book. It's a heady thing. It comes up against a lot of ideas, as science fiction often does. So let's jump in. Toward Eternity begins in South Africa. It's a near future world where scientists are currently conducting trials for a cancer cure. And the way that this cure works is that it replaces all the cells in your body with nanites, tiny cell-sized robots. Gradually, your body becomes something else. And a side effect of that is immortality. This clinical trial had a patient 0 who sadly didn't live. Their cancer returned even after the treatment, and they died. But at the beginning, we are following Yong-hoon. Yong-hoon is patient 1, and for him, the treatment is working. Yong-hoon is a Korean literary scholar who lives in South Africa, and he recently created an AI that is able to understand, appreciate, and analyze poetry. That's Yong-hoon's specialty, poetry. And poetry is vitally important to this book. Yong-hoon is an interesting and impressive person, being a literary scholar who turned to engineering and created an AI, which itself is a literary scholar. But one day, Yong-hoon disappears. He's in the lab talking to his AI, Panet, which incidentally he named in a dedication to his late husband. And suddenly he hears his late husband call out to him somehow. He walks out of the room and vanishes, just blips out of existence. And the novel begins with an investigation into what exactly happened to him. And the thing that happened to him will gradually become a kind of phenomenon known as rapturing, which has something to do with this method of replacing our cells with nanites. But I won't dwell on that too much. See, Yong-hoon eventually comes back pretty soon after. I think it's like a day or two. And then we get his perspective, where he immediately reveals that he knows he's not Yong-hoon. He is some kind of consciousness that was born out in the ether somewhere, and when Yong-hoon's body suddenly returned, this consciousness was dragged into the body to fill it, and then to gradually be filled up with his memories, his personality, while still being aware that it is not him. But as it now lives as him, it takes on the role of being him. And so through that perspective, we learn about his past. We get lots of flashbacks into his work, into how he ended up moving to South Africa, into his marriage and the death of his husband. Now remember, this book is about 250 pages, and it takes us beyond the borders of Earth and far, far into the future toward eternity. And yet we spend so much time at the beginning learning about this guy, setting the stage, falling into the minds and the lives of these characters. And eventually we're going to be swept away through time and space. But I won't give you any details about that. I'll just tease that it happens. Toward Eternity uses this clinical trial of replacing our cells with robot cells, and also uses the literary scholar AI Panet as a way to explore our mortality, our humanity, and what exactly it means to be human. And it's here that I feel a desperate need to compare this book to the works of Emily St. John Mandel. I was reminded of her books and her philosophy time and again as I was reading this. Her book Station 11 is a post-apocalyptic story, but it's not about the survival of humanity so much as it is the survival of our art and culture, and how it's the things that we have created that come to define us. And in terms of scope, where this book goes, the journeys it takes us on, just how much time and space is covered, it also reminded me of her book The Sea of Tranquility. I'm a big fan of her writing, and I kept thinking about it as I read this book. So if you like Emily St. John Mandel, you're going to love this novel. Now, as someone for whom art, literature, and language make up so much of his own life, it's clear that Anton put a lot of himself into this novel. And I think that's what gives it so much intimacy. As I said at the beginning, we have a very intimate relationship with these characters, with Yong-hoon especially. And I think there's a lot of Anton in this character. But as I said, philosophically, we're exploring art, literature, and language. There's a moment where one character talks to another about how language is not a vehicle for our self-expression, for our personalities. Language, in fact, defines who we are, how we see the world, what our personalities are, etc. That's the power and importance of language. And then steadily we move beyond language into conversations about storytelling and art in general, especially poetry, which is a theme and a motif throughout this whole book. And there's a wonderful quote here that I noted down, which I'm really excited to talk to Anton about. To write a story about someone is to create someone. What else can we be but stories about ourselves that we tell ourselves? I would get that tattooed on me. It is a remarkably powerful and hefty, weighty statement. The kind of thing that you can just sit and mull over and talk to other people about and write a fucking novel about. Like the works of Emily St. John Mandel, Toward Eternity is about storytelling. It is about the things that we remember, the heredity of language and art, and what those mean on a cultural scale, in the sense of time and linearity, and also on a personal scale. The stories we tell are who and what we are. The art we create is purer and more important than who we are. In fact, it is who and what we are. There's a moment in a flashback early on where Yong-hoon is talking about the research he did as a literary scholar and how poetry is in fact truth. The poetry that we write isn't just artistic expression, but rather an absolute truth. When one reads the poem, one becomes that self. Poetry is different from fiction. It's not about story, it's not about becoming someone else. There's an old idea in literary studies that if you read poetry, it works like an incantation that primes and channels your mind for certain thoughts and emotions. These effects produce a new self. Many Victorian writers, faced with the new freedoms of modernity, were trying to write themselves into new selves to suit the new era. Poetry makes us all into magicians. These are incredible ideas that Anton's presenting us with. And he takes those ideas about poetry and injects them into a science fiction story that transcends time and space, about bodies replaced with tiny robot cells. And it all works and it all makes sense and it is all so beautiful. It's an intense work of philosophy, this book, in my opinion. But a lot of science fiction is, and sci-fi often demands that we accept and work through and process and mull over all of these ideas, and Anton is just pushing science fiction forward as it should be pushed. As a sci-fi fan, as a poet, and as someone with a deep love and respect for language and communication between people, I am in love with this thing. It gives me everything that I want out of an intense philosophical work of science fiction about poetry, at least in part. I could talk about this book a lot, and I will when I interview Anton next month. Again, the interview is on the 12th of August, but if you can't make it to that one, there are others. It's a tour. Go listen to Anton talk, but also definitely be at my one, where I'm the host, because mine's gonna be the best one. Anyway, read this book. If you're a sci-fi fan who loves big ideas, this is for you. And if by chance you also happen to love really, really grotesque and nasty works of transgender horror fiction, I wrote a book and all. This is a collection of really nasty and grotesque horror stories about being trans. It's icky and yucky, and I'm very proud of it. You can find links to my book in the description. Go buy it. Get them both. Treat yourself, I don't know. And also subscribe for books.